It was a cold evening in downtown Atlanta, and the wind blew hard through the tall buildings. People hurried past each other, wearing warm coats and holding coffee cups. Nobody noticed the little girl sitting alone on the side of the street. Near a trash bin, her blanket was torn, her shoes didn't match, and her toy bear had no eyes. But she sat there quietly, not crying, not begging, just watching the world move without her. Across the street, Brian Cole stepped out of a luxury hotel. He was tall, well-dressed, and clearly rich. His black suit was perfectly tailored, and his watch alone cost more than most people made in a year. He had just come out of a meeting that went badly. Millions were lost on a business deal. And the board members blamed him. He was angry, tired, and didn't care about anything but getting to his car. As he walked toward the valet, something caught his a pair of small eyes looking up at him from across the street. He turned and saw her, sitting still, her hands folded around her chest like she was trying to stay warm. Brian paused for a second, not knowing why he looked back. He wasn't the type to stop for strangers, and definitely not for beggars. But something about her felt different, like she was waiting for him, not in a needy way, but in a peaceful way. He frowned and walked across the street, not knowing what he would say. As he got closer, the girl smiled at him, a soft, gentle smile that didn't match her situation. Before he could speak, she said, "Sir, I'll pray for you." Her voice was calm, almost like she could see something inside him that even he had forgotten. Brian blinked, confused, and let out a short laugh. "Pray for me," he said. "I don't need your prayers, little one." He was used to people asking him for things: money, jobs, favors, but no one had ever offered him something with such pure kindness, and from a child with nothing. It made no sense. He shook his head, forced a smile, and said, "Take care of yourself," before walking away. He got into his car, leaned back in the soft leather seat, and told the driver to go. But as the car moved forward, Brian looked back through the window. The girl hadn't moved, not even a little. She still sat there with her hands wrapped around that torn bear, still looking up at the sky. It made his chest feel tight for a moment, though he didn't know why. The driver talked about traffic and weather, but Brian wasn't listening. He kept thinking about what she said. "I'll pray for you." Why did that bother him so much? He was the one with success, power, a mansion, and a yacht. What could that girl possibly see in him that needed praying for? He tried to brush the thought away and focus on the next business move, but the deal was still lost, and the board was angry. He knew he was about to face a storm at work, but still, something deeper bothered him, a feeling he hadn't felt in years. That night, when Brian sat alone in his apartment, drinking from a glass of expensive wine, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Her voice echoed in his head over and over. Again, "I'll pray for you." He even laughed again, shaking his head. But this time, it wasn't funny. He felt empty. He had everything, but in that moment, he felt small. He remembered when he was a kid, he had been poor too once. And hungry. He had a sister, and they used to sleep on the floor of a shelter, but he had worked his way out, fought to climb to the top, and never looked back. He had pushed all those memories deep down, but now they were coming up again. He got up and looked out the window. From his penthouse, the city looked peaceful, but somewhere down there, a little girl was sleeping in the cold. And she had offered him a prayer, not even knowing his name. Brian sat back down and sighed deeply. That small moment, that simple sentence, had cracked something inside him. He didn't know why it mattered so much, but he knew one thing: he had to see her again. That one moment on the street was not just a meeting. It felt like a message, a quiet signal from something bigger. And though he still didn't fully understand it, he couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had started to change inside Brian Cole. And it all began the moment a homeless black girl said she would pray for him, not for his money, not for his success, but for his heart, and even though he didn't show it at the time. That small act of kindness had touched something deep inside him, and that was only the beginning. Brian sat in the back seat of his luxury car, trying to focus on the road ahead. The driver talked about the traffic and asked where to drop him off, but Brian only nodded, his eyes still distant. The city lights flashed past the windows, and the world outside looked normal, fast, and full of noise, but inside Brian's head, everything was quiet except one voice, the voice of the little homeless girl. "I'll pray for you," she had said. He leaned back and closed his eyes, hoping the thought would go away. He had work to do, meetings tomorrow, money to recover, and angry board members to deal with. But her voice stayed with him, as if someone had planted it deep in his heart. He tried to laugh again, like he did earlier. But the laugh didn't come out. Instead, he felt something in his chest, a strange tightness he hadn't felt in years. He opened his eyes and stared at the roof of the car. What did she mean by praying for him? What did she see in him? He was the rich man, not her. He had everything, and she had nothing. Still, she spoke like he was the one who needed help. The driver stopped at a red light, and Brian looked out the window again. People were walking by, laughing, talking, holding shopping bags. Nobody noticed how broken the city really was, and now Brian was starting to see it too. He looked down at his hands, strong and clean, the same hands that had built an empire, shaken hands with world leaders, signed million-dollar deals, but those hands had never reached out to someone like her. Not since he had made it to the top. The light turned green, and the car moved again. Brian suddenly remembered something he hadn't thought about in a long time: his little sister. Her name was Jasmine. And she used to pray too. She would whisper little prayers at night when they were kids, lying on thin mattresses in the corner of a shelter. Back then, he didn't believe in prayer either. But Jasmine did, and somehow her prayers made things feel less scary. He lost her after they were separated in foster care. He tried to forget her over the years, focusing on business and money. But now, that little girl's voice on the street had brought everything back. It was like Jasmine was speaking through her, reminding him of who he used to be. The driver asked again, "Sir, home or office?" Brian blinked, unsure what to say. Home felt cold and empty, and the office felt like a cage. He said, "Just drive around for a while." The driver nodded and kept going, taking slow turns through quiet streets. Brian looked out again, this time really looking. He saw tents under bridges, shopping carts filled with clothes, and people sleeping on cardboard. He had passed these sights hundreds of times before. But this time they looked different. This time he felt something. He pulled out his phone and opened an old photo app. It took him a while to find the picture, one of the only ones he had of Jasmine. They were both kids in the photo, smiling, her arms around his neck. She looked like Maya, the girl from the street, not in the face, but in the eyes, soft eyes, filled with strength and peace, even when life was hard. He put the phone away and looked straight ahead. The driver asked again, "Are you sure you don't want to go home?" Brian shook his head slowly and said, "No, not yet." There was something he needed to understand first. Why did her words hit him so hard? Why couldn't he stop thinking about her? And why did he feel more empty now than he had in years? Maybe it was because he realized how alone he had become. He had people around him, assistants, bodyguards, partners, but no one with him. No one who looked at him and saw something more than a wallet or a CEO. But Maya, the homeless girl, had looked at him differently. She didn't ask for anything. She gave something instead. A prayer, a blessing from someone who had nothing but still wanted to give. The car passed the same corner where he had first seen her. She wasn't there now, but he stared at the empty spot as if she might appear again. The broken toy bear was gone, and the trash bin stood silent. The wind had picked up again, and the night felt colder. Brian sighed deeply and leaned back again. He didn't understand what was happening to him. He had been rich for so long, proud for so long, and blind for even longer. But now he was starting to see something, not just outside, but inside himself, and the scariest part was, he didn't know how to go back to the way he was before he heard that little voice. Before she said those 5 simple words that shook his world. "I'll pray for you." He didn't know why, but somehow it felt like everything in his life had changed in that moment, and deep down, he knew this wasn't the end of it. Something had begun, something real, something that might heal him. He just didn't know how yet. But he was going to find out, even if it meant going back to the cold streets. Even if it meant facing things he had buried for years, because for the first time in forever, Brian Cole felt, and that feeling scared him more than any business failure ever could. The next morning, Brian woke up early, before the sun had even risen. He sat on the edge of his bed, his hands covering his face. He hadn't slept much, just tossed and turned all night. His mind kept going back to the little girl on the street, the way she looked at him. The way she spoke, her words echoed again and again. "I'll pray for you." He didn't know why it affected him so deeply, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. Brian stood up, put on simple clothes, not his usual expensive suit, but jeans, and a jacket. He didn't want to look like a businessman today. He didn't want to scare her or make her think he came to show off. He only wanted to find her again, to understand what she meant, and maybe to say thank you. Outside, the streets were still quiet. Only a few cars passed by. He walked toward the same corner where he had seen her yesterday. The trash bin was still there, but the girl was gone. No blanket, no toy bear, nothing. It was like she had never been there at all. Brian looked around, checking the alleys nearby. He walked 4 blocks, asking himself if he was doing the right thing. He felt strange, like a lost man looking for something only he could see. After a while, he stopped and asked a food truck vendor, "Excuse me, have you seen a little girl around here?" "Black girl, short hair, carries a stuffed bear, maybe 10 or 11. The vendor looked up from the grill and squinted at him. "You talking about Maya?" He said, "Yeah, I've seen her a few times." Brian's heart jumped. "Yes, I think that's her. Do you know where she is now?" The man shook his head. "Nah, kid comes and goes, never stays in one place, sleeps where she can, eats when someone offers." Brian nodded slowly, feeling both hope and worry. He thanked the man and kept moving. Now more determined, he asked other shopkeepers, bus drivers, even a security guard near a closed store. Most said the same thing. "Yeah, she's around. But she don't talk much." One woman said, "She's kind, never begs. Always says kind words even when she's hungry." Brian didn't expect that. How could someone with so little be so full of peace? It confused him, it humbled him, and it made him feel even smaller inside. After an hour of walking, he reached a small church at the corner of an old block. The front gate was open and people stood in line for food. A soup kitchen was serving hot meals to the homeless. Brian looked through the crowd, scanning every face, and there she was, sitting on the steps of the church, her back against the wall, her bear in her lap. She was not eating, just watching others with a soft smile. She looked calm, like nothing in the world could shake her. Brian walked slowly toward her, his heart beating fast. What was he supposed to say? Would she remember him? Would she run away? As he got closer, Maya looked up and smiled again. It was the same gentle smile from yesterday, like she had been waiting for him all along. "You came back," she said, in a quiet voice. Brian knelt down so he wouldn't tower over her. "I did," he said, trying to find the right words. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said." Maya looked at him, not confused, not surprised, just kind. "I prayed for you last night," she said. "Like I said I would, Brian." felt a lump in his throat. He didn't know how to respond. "You don't even know me," he whispered. "Why would you pray for someone like me?" Maya held her bear tightly and shrugged. "You looked like you needed it." Those words hit him harder than anything ever had. He sat beside her on the cold step, forgetting who he was, forgetting the world. He was just a man sitting next to a little girl who had nothing, yet somehow she had given him more than anyone else ever had. They sat there for a while in silence. Brian watched people get food, some smiling, some crying. He saw the real world for the first time, not numbers or profits, but people. Finally, he said, "Maya, is there anything you need? Anything I can give you?" She shook her head. "I don't need anything," she said softly. "I just need to keep praying." Brian looked at her with amazement. This little girl, homeless and alone, had more peace in her heart than he ever had in his mansion, he realized. Then that he had come not to save her, but to be saved himself. She didn't ask for help, but she gave him something no one else had: hope. He stood up and said, "Can I see you again?" Maya nodded. "I'm always around, somewhere." Brian left the church with a strange feeling in his chest. It was not pain this time, it was warmth. For the first time in years, he felt alive. He didn't fully understand it yet, but he knew. One thing he had to come back. He had to find out more about this little girl, because something about her was changing him. And maybe, just maybe, she was leading him toward something greater than himself. The next day, Brian returned to the church. He had barely slept again. But this time, it wasn't because of stress. It was because of something new, something peaceful. But also strange. He kept hearing Maya's words in his head. "I prayed for you last night." That one sentence had touched something inside him. He had lived his life chasing power, money, and control. But this little girl, who had nothing, gave him something his millions never could: genuine care. And she didn't even ask for anything in return when Brian arrived. He saw Maya sitting on the same steps again. She was humming to herself, gently rocking her old stuffed bear back and forth. People walked by, some looked, most didn't. To them, she was just another homeless kid. But to Brian, she was something else. She was a mystery. A light in the middle of his dark world. He walked up slowly, not wanting to scare her. She looked up, smiled, and said, "You came back again." Brian smiled too. "Of course I did." Then he sat down beside her like an old friend. For a while, they didn't say much. They just sat together, quietly watching people line up for food. Then, Brian finally asked, "Maya, can I ask you something?" She nodded gently. "Sure. Why do you pray for people?" She thought for a moment, then answered, "Because sometimes people don't know they're hurting, but God does." Brian felt something stir in his chest again. He had everything: fame, money, power, but she was right. He had been hurting for years. And he didn't even know it. He looked down and said, "You're just a kid, Maya. But you talk like someone who's lived 1,000 lives." Maya gave a soft laugh. "Life teaches you a lot when you don't have much." Brian leaned back and looked up at the sky. It was cloudy, the kind of gray sky that matched how he felt inside for so long. Then he asked her, "Do you ever pray for yourself?" Maya shook her head. "I used to, but then I stopped." "Why?" he asked, surprised. She hugged her bear closer and said, "Because praying for others makes me feel less lonely." Brian turned his head to look at her. She wasn't trying to be wise or deep. She was just telling the truth. He realized how powerful her heart was. She could have been angry at the world, but she chose kindness. She could have begged for food, but instead she gave blessings. Brian had a hard time believing someone like her really existed. A child so pure, so strong, yet so alone, and still, she carried peace like a crown. "Maya," he said softly, "can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" She looked up at him with quiet eyes and nodded. Brian took a deep breath and said, I had a sister. When I was young, her name was Jasmine. She and I were in a foster home, like you might have been. One day, we were split up, and I never saw her again. I told myself I'd forget, that I'd just work harder and become rich, powerful, successful. But last night, after I saw you, I cried for the first time in 20 years. Maya didn't say anything right away. She just reached out and touched his hand gently. Her fingers were cold, but the gesture was warm. You still love her, she said, even if she's not here. Brian nodded slowly, unable to speak. They sat in silence for a few moments. Then Maya whispered, I'll pray for Jasmine too. Brian's throat tightened and his eyes burned. This girl, this tiny soul wrapped in rags, had just given him more healing than any doctor, any therapist, any success ever had. Maya, he said again, I want to help you. She looked at him but didn't smile this time. Everyone says that, she replied quietly, but then they disappear. Brian shook his head. I'm not like them. She didn't argue, but she didn't believe it either. She had learned to live with low hopes. Brian could see that in her eyes, hope was something dangerous for her, something she didn't allow herself to feel too often. I don't want to take you away or force you to change, he said. I just want you to have a safe place to sleep. Clean clothes, warm food. Would you let me do that? Maya didn't answer right away. She looked down at her bear, then at the sky, then back at Brian. Finally, she said, You can come again tomorrow if you want. And maybe bring some hot chocolate. Brian smiled through the tears. He didn't let fall. Deal, he said softly, as the sun began to set. Brian walked away, feeling something he hadn't felt in decades: lightness. Not because he had fixed anything, but because he had finally started to listen. And Maya, without trying, without even knowing, had opened his heart wide enough to feel again. She had prayed for him, and somehow, he was already changing. Not in big ways, but in the small ones that truly mattered. And for the first time, Brian realized maybe the richest people in the world aren't the ones with money. Maybe they're the ones who know how to give, even when they have nothing. The next day, Brian walked to the church again, holding a cup of hot chocolate in his hand. The wind was cold, and gray clouds covered the sky. But his heart felt warm, lighter than it had in years. He wasn't just going to check on Maya. He was going to see a friend, a little girl who had changed something inside him without even trying. When he reached the church steps, she was already there. She looked up and gave a small smile as he held out the drink. You remembered, she said softly. I told you I would, Brian replied with a smile. She took the cup carefully with both hands and sipped slowly, her eyes closing as the warmth spread through her body. It was probably the first warm drink she had in weeks, maybe longer. They sat on the steps like before, watching the world move by. People passed them without stopping, not knowing that something special was happening right there on the cold concrete. Brian looked at Maya's thin arms and the holes in her sweater. It hurt him deeply to see someone so young in such a state. How long have you been on the streets, Maya? He asked gently. She didn't answer right away, just looked straight ahead. Since I was 7, she finally whispered. Brian felt his stomach turn. She was only 11 now. That meant almost half her life had been spent outside, alone. What? About your parents? He asked softly. My mom left, Maya said, her voice flat. She said she'd be back, but she never came. And your dad? Maya looked down, her fingers playing with the edge of her sleeve. He was shot. I saw it happen. Brian froze. The air around him felt heavy. I'm so sorry, Maya, he said, not knowing what else to say. Maya just nodded. It was a long time ago. She looked up at him and said, It's okay. I don't cry about it anymore. Brian shook his head. You don't have to be strong all the time. I do, she replied. There's no one else to be strong for me. Those words hit Brian harder than anything else. He had spent years pretending to be strong, too, but Maya didn't have a mansion or a private office to hide her pain. She carried it in the open and still chose to be kind. "You shouldn't be out here," Brian said. "You deserve a home, a bed, a safe place." Maya didn't answer, just sipped the last of her drink. "I want to help," Brian continued. "Really help, not just today, but every day." Maya looked at him, her eyes serious now. "Even when I'm not easy to help." Brian nodded. Even then, they sat in silence again. But this time, it felt like something was building between them. A trust, slow and fragile, but real. Brian looked at her and said, "You know, you remind me of my sister Jasmine." Maya raised her eyebrows. "Was she like me?" "In some ways," Brian said, "she believed in things I didn't understand. She used to pray, just like you." Maya smiled. "She sounds nice." "She was," Brian said, "and brave." "Like you." Maya stared at her empty cup for a moment, then asked, "Why didn't you find her?" Brian looked down, shame rising in his chest. "I was young too," he said. "I was scared. I ran toward success so I wouldn't feel the pain, but now I think I lost something more important." Maya nodded, not judging, just listening. "It's not too late," she whispered. Brian looked at her, confused. "To do what?" "To find what you lost," she said. "Maybe not her, but something else." Brian smiled. Though his eyes were wet, "I think I already found it," he said quietly. Maya tilted her head. "What?" "You," he said. "You gave me back something I didn't even know I needed." Maya didn't smile at first. She just looked at him, as if trying to decide whether to believe it. Then she said, "You're weird, Mr. Brian." He laughed. And she finally giggled too. That was the first time he had heard her laugh. And it made his heart feel full. "Come with me," he said suddenly, standing up. Maya looked confused. "Where?" "I want to show you something," he said. Just for a few minutes, she hesitated, but then stood up slowly, still holding her bear. "Okay," she said, "but I'm not going far." They walked together down the block, and Brian led her to a small coffee shop. The smell of warm bread and chocolate filled the air. People sat inside, smiling, talking, safe. Brian opened the door and said, "Let's sit inside today, just for a little while." Maya stepped in carefully, her eyes wide. She looked out of place, but not because of her clothes. Because she wasn't used to being somewhere warm and full of kindness. They sat at a small table near the window. Brian ordered hot food and more hot chocolate. Maya looked around slowly, as if trying to believe this was real. "This is the nicest place I've ever been in," she said softly. Brian looked at her and made a silent promise. "I will never let her go back to the cold," as she ate quietly. Brian knew something important had happened. Not just a meal or a moment, but a connection. He wasn't just helping a homeless girl. He was beginning to heal both their lives. For the next few days, Brian visited Maya every morning. Sometimes she was already waiting on the church steps. Sometimes he had to look for her near the soup line or the small alley beside the bakery. Each day, he brought her something warm: hot chocolate, muffins, a scarf, or socks. And each day, she greeted him with the same soft smile and the same peaceful eyes, but she still refused to take anything more. Every time he mentioned giving her money or finding her a shelter, Kaya would shake her head. "I don't want to go to one of those places," she said. "I've been to them and they're not kind." Brian didn't understand at first. How could someone so young be afraid of shelters meant to help? So one day he asked, "Can you tell me what happened there?" They were sitting behind the church building. Where it was quiet and hidden from the street, Maya sat on a box, hugging her bear tightly. She looked down and began to speak in a slow, tired voice. "They put me in a place with too many people," she said. "The rooms were loud and dark, and sometimes people weren't nice. Brian listened carefully, not interrupting. One night, Maya continued. One of the older kids hit me because I didn't give her my blanket. I told the lady in charge, but she said there weren't enough blankets for everyone. She told me to stop complaining. Brian clenched his fists without meaning to. His heart broke for her, and guilt burned in his chest. He thought about how much he had wasted on meaningless things, while a child like Maya had no protection. I ran away, she said softly. It was cold outside, but I felt safer. Brian gently asked, "Have you ever had a safe home?" Maya shook her head slowly. "Not since my dad died." Brian wanted to cry. But he knew he couldn't, not now. He had to be strong for her. "You deserve better," he said quietly. Maya didn't say anything. She looked at him with eyes that seemed older than her years. Later that evening, Brian sat in his apartment, staring out the window. The city lights were beautiful, but his mind was still filled with Maya's voice. She was strong, but no child should have to be that strong. He decided something that night. He wasn't going to just visit her. He was going to change her life completely the next day. Brian spoke to his lawyer and asked what he needed to do to take guardianship of a homeless child. The lawyer was shocked. "Do you know this girl personally?" "Yes," Brian said. "She's smarter, kinder, and braver than anyone I've ever met. But she's been through too much, and I won't let her stay on the street." The lawyer agreed to begin the paperwork, but it would take time. Brian understood, but he didn't plan to wait before helping. He started preparing a guest house behind his main home. It had been empty for years, but now he asked cleaners to fix it. Paint it, make it warm and bright. He added toys, books, blankets, and a small stuffed bear. Just like Maya's, he didn't tell her yet because he wasn't sure how she would react. She didn't trust easily, and he didn't want to rush her, eh? Few days later, Brian brought her to a small park. They sat near a quiet pond. Feeding ducks with pieces of bread, Maya looked happy, her face calm, her shoulders relaxed. Brian turned to her and asked, "Can I show you something?" She nodded, and they walked to his car together. When they reached his house, Maya looked nervous. "I've never been in a place like this," she said. Brian smiled. "You're not here to stay inside the big house." He led her around the back to the guest house. The door opened to a clean, warm room with sunlight coming through the window. There was a bed with soft covers, a bookshelf with storybooks, and even a small desk with coloring pencils. Maya froze at the doorway, her eyes wide. "This is for me," she whispered. "If you want it," Brian said. "It's yours." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't move. She was afraid to believe it was real. "I don't have to stay forever," he said. "Just one night. See how it feels." Maya walked slowly to the bed and sat down. She looked around like someone in a dream. After a long pause, she said, "No one's ever done something like this for me." Brian knelt beside her and replied, "You've done something for me too." That night, Brian gave her a warm meal and left her to rest. He didn't push, he didn't ask questions, he just let her be. And for the first time in a long time, Maya slept in a real bed, under a roof, with clean sheets and a nightlight beside her. Brian stood outside her window for a few minutes, watching quietly. He saw her sleeping peacefully. Holding her stuffed bear, he felt a tear roll down his cheek, not from sadness, but from relief. She was safe now, even if just for one night, and he was no longer the same man he used to be. That little girl had taught him what love really meant. Not words, not gifts, but showing up, caring, and staying. The next morning, Brian stood outside the guest house with 2 cups of hot chocolate. The air was cool, and soft sunlight touched the garden as birds chirped in the trees. He knocked gently on the door, unsure if Maya would be awake a few seconds. Later, the door creaked open, and she peeked out, her eyes still sleepy. She looked different, not scared, not cold, just calm. "Good morning," Brian said. Holding out the cup, Maya blinked, then gave a small smile and took the cup with both hands. She sat on the porch steps, sipping slowly. Brian sat beside her, watching her carefully. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked. Maya nodded. "It was strange." "Strange?" "Yeah," she said. "I'm not used to quiet, or a soft bed, or safety." Brian's chest tightened. He didn't know how many nights she had slept with fear around her, but he felt thankful that now, at least for a little while, she didn't have to. They spent the morning walking through the small garden behind the house. Brian showed her the flowers, the little pond, and even let her feed the birds. Maya looked like a different person. She laughed a few times, asked questions, and even chased a butterfly. Brian had never seen her so full of life. And he realized something important. This wasn't just a kind act anymore. He cared for her like family. Later that afternoon, Brian took her to a bookstore. She stood in the children's section, eyes wide as she stared at the shelves filled with books. "You can pick anything you want," Brian said. Maya looked at him in shock. "Anything?" He nodded, and she slowly reached for a storybook with colorful pictures. She hugged it tightly, not because of the story, but because it was hers. As the days passed, Maya started opening up more. She told Brian about her favorite dreams, the songs she used to sing with her father, and how she used to believe stars were tiny angels. Brian listened to every word, memorizing her voice, her laughter, and the way her eyes lit up when she talked. But even with all the good moments, there were still hard days. Sometimes Maya would wake up from a nightmare, sweating and crying. She didn't always want to talk about it. But Brian would sit with Kay. Maya Kay would sit with her, silent, just holding her hand. One night, she said softly, "I keep thinking it's going to be taken away." Brian looked at her gently. "It's not. You sure?" She whispered. "I'm sure," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." That promise meant everything. Not because it came from a rich man, but because it came from someone who kept showing up. Soon, Brian began the official paperwork to adopt Maya. His lawyer explained the process was slow, with interviews, checks, and rules. But Brian didn't care how long it took. He would wait as long as needed if it meant Maya could be his daughter. One afternoon, while Maya was drawing in the garden, Brian sat beside her and said, "I want to ask you something important." She looked up, curious. "If you want," he continued. "I'd like to make this your home, forever." Maya froze, her pencil in midair. "Forever?" She repeated softly. Brian nodded. "If you say yes." She didn't answer right away, but tears filled her eyes. Then she stood up, walked to him, and hugged him tightly. "You really mean it?" She whispered against his chest. "I do." Brian replied, holding her close. From that moment on, something changed between them. Maya smiled more, laughed louder, and even called him Mr. Brian less, and Papa once. By accident, Brian heard it, and though she looked embarrassed, he didn't correct her. He simply smiled and said, "I like that." One weekend, they went to a park outside the city. Maya ran across the green fields, climbed trees, and played with other kids. At one point, she came running back with a flower in her hand. She placed it behind Brian's ear and giggled. "You look like a garden statue now," she said, laughing. Brian laughed too, and everyone nearby could feel the joy between them. In the evening, while driving back home, Maya sat in the front seat, her head resting on Brian's shoulder. "Thank you for finding me," she whispered. Brian looked at her with teary eyes. "No, Maya. Thank you for finding me." He had been lost, too lost in success, money, and loneliness, and she, with nothing but kindness and a prayer, brought him back to life. That night, while tucking her into bed, Maya asked, "Do you still hear my prayer?" Brian smiled and said, "Every day," and deep inside, he knew that one small voice on the street had changed everything. She had healed a part of him that money never could. Weeks passed, and life slowly settled into something new for both Brian and Maya. She now had her own room, her own bed, and her own space filled with books, clothes, and drawings taped to the wall. Every morning, Brian made her breakfast, and every evening they sat together, sometimes reading, sometimes just talking. The guest house was no longer just a place to sleep. Had become a home. Maya had started school again. At a nearby learning center that helped children catch up, she was nervous on the first day, holding tightly to Brian's hand, but he smiled and said, "You're stronger than you think." She took a deep breath and walked in. When he picked her up later, she ran to him and said, "I made a friend today." That small sentence made Brian's heart feel full. He remembered how Maya once said, she didn't need anything, just prayer, but now she had more than prayers. She had friendship, learning, safety, and love. One Friday evening, Brian was invited to speak at a charity gala. It was a big event, with wealthy people, news reporters, and business leaders. Brian had never brought Maya to such events before. But this time he asked her, "Would you come with me?" Maya looked surprised. "Me? Why?" "Because you're a part of my life now," he said, "and this story. It's yours too." She wore a simple dress he had bought her, blue with tiny stars printed on it. Her hair was neatly brushed, and she held Brian's hand tightly as they walked into the grand hall. People looked at her curiously, but Brian didn't care. He knew some wouldn't understand. But that didn't matter. This was real. This was family. When it was Brian's turn to speak, he stood on stage, cleared his throat, and looked out at the crowd. "I used to think success meant money, power, and numbers," he said. "I chased it for years, and I got everything I ever want, except peace." He paused, looking down at Maya, who sat in the front row, smiling softly. "And then, one cold evening, I met a little girl on the street," he continued. "She had nothing, not even shoes that matched. But she looked up at me and said 5 words, 'I'll pray for you.'" The room went silent. Every eye watching him closely. "I laughed at first," Brian admitted, "but that girl's prayer, it stayed with me. It changed me. Because she didn't want anything from me, he only wanted me to heal." He looked back at Maya, his voice shaking. "She reminded me what love really means. It's not in big gestures or luxury. It's in showing up for someone who has no reason to trust you." Maya's eyes were shining with tears, but she didn't look away. She held her little stuffed bear in her lap, the same one she had when Brian first met her. It was cleaner now, still torn, but full of meaning. Brian finished his speech with a quiet voice. "I stand here tonight as a changed man, not because of business, but because of one small, brave heart who believed in prayer. Her name is Maya, and she saved me." When he stepped down from the stage, people stood and clapped. Some were crying, others stood silently in respect. But Brian didn't care about the applause. He only looked at Maya. She stood and ran into his arms, hugging him tightly. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "No," Brian said. "I'm proud of you." That night, as they drove home, the sky was clear and filled with stars. Maya looked out the window and said, "You know what?" Brian asked, smiling. "I think my prayers worked." Brian laughed softly. "I know they did." They reached home, and Maya ran into the guest house. Still full of energy, Brian stood outside for a moment. Looking up at the stars, he thought about how much his life had changed in just a few months. He used to sit in silence in a cold apartment, alone with his money. Now, he had a little girl with a big heart, who reminded him how to feel. Later, Maya gave him a drawing she made. It showed 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, holding hands under a sky full of stars. She had written something at the top in shaky letters. "Thank you for finding me, Papa." Brian didn't speak. He just pulled her into a hug. And for the first time in years, his tears didn't come from sadness. They came from joy. Maya had found a home, and Brian had found something even greater. He found peace, love, and a reason to wake up each morning with a smile. And all of it began with 5 simple words from a little girl on the street. I'll pray for you.